Welcome to the Luca Ricci podcast. Today I'll be discussing a film reflection on the Doctrine of Discovery, Stolen Lands, Strong Hearts documentary. This is for my Indigenous Peoples in the Media class. The documentary, The Doctrine of Discovery, Stolen Lands, Strong Hearts dives deeply into the historical and current effects of the Doctrine of Discovery on the Indigenous peoples of Canada. It can be seen in the documentary that Indigenous lands were taken away and their sovereignty was compromised as a result of the European colonial expansion, which was justified by this legal and intellectual framework. The documentary closely looks at how this concept has influenced laws, regulations, and public perceptions that still have an impact on Indigenous communities today. The disparity between Indigenous and mainstream views on land ownership, the doctrine's ongoing legal and social consequences, and the psychological and cultural effects of colonization on the Indigenous peoples are the three primary aspects of the film that are discussed. There's a distinct contrast between Indigenous and mainstream Eurocentric ideas on land, and this is one of the documentary's primary topics. The foundation of the Doctrine of Discovery was the idea that non-Christian territories were empty and open to European colonization. This idea disregarded Indigenous sovereignty and provided justification for taking territory without permission, as the doctrine had been used to justify their conquests for centuries, further advancing the idea that European peoples believed their culture was superior above all others. This film shows how these concepts were incorporated into laws and treaties by European legal systems that still harm Indigenous communities in Canada. From the viewpoint of Indigenous people, land is seen as a living thing with cultural, spiritual, and community importance rather than something to be owned or exploited. In the documentary, Indigenous leaders and academics discuss their relationships with the land and how it's focused on reciprocity and stewardship rather than ownership and commercialization. Mainstream Western legal systems, which place a high priority on individual property rights and economic exploitation, are in opposition with this viewpoint. Through historical instances and current court cases involving land claims, the film skillfully depicts these differences. The Doctrine of Discovery continues to have an impact on current political and legal systems, making it more than just a relic. The film illustrates how the tenets of this philosophy have influenced Canadian legislation, such as the Indian Act and other Supreme Court decisions. For example, Indigenous communities are unfairly burdened with the requirement to demonstrate their land rights through colonial legal systems. The findings of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and the relationship to the Doctrine of Discovery are also discussed in the documentary. The film highlights that unless Canada and other colonial countries recognize and abolish the legal framework supporting this theory, genuine healing would not be possible. These legal experts and Indigenous activists who believe the laws based on the Doctrine of Discovery still serve as an excuse for resource exploitation, environmental damage, and infringements on Indigenous sovereignty back this argument. The Doctrine of Discovery explores the psychological and cultural trauma brought on by the colonization in addition to its legal and political impacts. The consequences of forced integration, systemic discrimination, and land loss are still felt by many Indigenous communities. Strong testimonies from Indigenous people who recall firsthand accounts of the intergenerational pain brought on by residential schools. The Canadian government forcefully placed over 100,000 Indigenous children in residential schools, taking away their Indigenous culture and identities to convert the children to Christianity. The doctrine was used to operate these schools that abused and harmed Indigenous peoples. The loss of traditional knowledge and cultural repression are featured in the film. The film's examination of Indigenous resiliency is among its most emotional features. Indigenous tribes have preserved their customs, languages, and cultural practices despite decades of abuse and oppression. The documentary highlights continuing land reclamation initiatives and movements like Idle No More to restore Indigenous rights and sovereignty. These instances of resilience and rebellion offer a positive contrast to the documentary's examination of past injustices. In conclusion, The Doctrine of Discovery is a powerful and essential documentary. The film reveals the colonial roots of Canada's political and judicial structure. In addition, the film asks audiences to consider the systems that still oppress Indigenous peoples by bringing to light the differences between Indigenous and mainstream viewpoints on land, the legal legacy of the Doctrine of Discovery, and the cultural effects of colonization. The documentary emphasizes how urgent land restoration, decolonization, and genuine healing are needed, acknowledging past injustices and pursuing a more fair and equal future requires an understanding of these issues. Thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed.